Thank you, Nick, and thank you so much to the conference organizers for the invitation to speak with you. It's a real honor. Oh, great, my slides. The need to transform our food system is widely recognized now. Hardly anyone argues with that. Even mainstream actors are saying we must transform the food system. But what kind of transformation do we mean? There are profoundly different ideas that are being put forward. Let's start with the Charles Dickens quote. Can hardly come to London without bringing up Charles Dickens. Best of times, it was the worst of times, the age of wisdom, the age of foolishness, the epoch of belief, the epoch of incredulity, the season of light, the season of darkness. I think his quote applies equally well to our times, as well as what he was writing about in the introduction to A Tale of Two Cities. On one hand, here on the left, in terms of the kinds of transformations that are being put forth, we have Klaus Schwab, who's the founder and executive chair of the World Economic Forum. He proposed the Great Redesign Initiative and then a Great Reset as COVID was raging around the world, both of which would be creating conditions for a quote-unquote stakeholder economy, as opposed to Westphalian nations and human rights-based law that would harness the innovations of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Drones, satellites, precision agriculture, robotics, the Internet of Things, automation. They get very excited about all this. A future of farming without farmers, other than farmers who are sitting in an office directing their machines. On the other hand, here on the right, we have the solidarity economy, the care economy, degrowth, and the pluriverse, a profoundly different idea. The pluriverse is a wealth of ideas that, for organizing society to serve everyone's well-being and to protect the planet. This image here has been adopted by the Wellbeing Alliance, and it's based on Kate Rayworth's image of the donut model, in which planetary boundaries are the outside limit and human rights or social needs are the inside border. The Wellbeing Alliance focuses on the need to fulfill human rights while living within planetary boundaries. We have been captured by the grand narrative of constant growth and modernization through privatization, science, and innovation led by industry. What we're seeing here, this is Sheila Jasanoff's quote from 2002, in which she's saying that the arrow of time points inexorably forward, and science and progress only lead in one direction. It's only linear. We need a new narrative. This was the grand narrative guiding the last century, but we need a new narrative. This narrative was all too manifest in the publications of the science group of the UN Food Systems Summit, by the way, which happened 2021 September. Moving from one vision to another requires a solid theory of change, and I want to show you here what needs to be in a theory of change. What's below is simply a sample theory from the group Align. A theory of change begins with a vision of how we want things to be, the world we want to see, and it backcasts from there to a realistic assessment of current conditions based on a good power analysis, the preconditions and assumptions that are related to that change, and then strategic pathways of action and specific outcomes and impact. Tim Benton's presentation earlier today had some really great material about assumptions of different visions of the future. The nonprofit organization HEAL in the United States is a multi-sector, multiracial coalition that's trying to build collective power to transform our food and farm systems. And its theory of change begins with these assumptions, which I think are quite valid. They certainly cohere with what I'm seeing out there as the landscape for social change. First of all, the root causes of our destructive food system are tied to the mythologies, the ideologies that place profit over people and the planet. Second, the transition that we really need is not currently feasible. There are ways to get to it, but we need to change the conditions in the structure. Third, and I'll be coming back to this a little bit later in my presentation, no single organization, alliance, or sector can transform the system working on its own. We need to be building stronger coalitions. And fourth, very importantly, frontline and burdened communities have solutions for the systemic change that's needed, and they need to be working within their communities, and we need to be following the guidance that they're giving to us. Because if we focus on improving conditions for the most marginalized people, then everyone will benefit. And finally, to make the change that we want to see, we need to work in and influence multiple sectors, multiple places. So what's prevented change from happening so far? Let me propose 3 barriers. First is the shifts to authoritarian governments. I'm drawing on some diagrams from the VDEM Institute, which has been looking at democratization. And they have a rather dismal picture of what's happening right now, that there are far fewer countries that are democratizing than countries moving in an authoritarian direction. This is a true problem for the food system changes that we need to see, because food democracy is impossible if civic democracy has been destroyed. But as we see, civic democracy is being destroyed rapidly. The global level of democracy has been backsliding, and we're at the point now where we were in 1986. This is based on a multitude of indicators, and I recommend going to their reports if you'd like to see more detail on how they're actually tracking democratization. The second barrier that I want to propose is global and domestic inequality and the intransigence of the economic elite. The wealth of the top 1% globally is literally off the charts. This diagram over on the left. And if we look at the figure on the right, the top 1% emits 17% of the carbon in the atmosphere, and the top 10%, if you combine these first 2 diagrams on the bottom row of this set of figures, the top 10% is responsible for nearly half of carbon emissions. VDEM states that disinformation, polarization, and autocratization reinforce each other. The rise of disinformation, including about greenhouse gas emissions, is one of the ways that autocrats are driving polarization and preventing us from achieving that change that we want to see. And it's also one of the ways that they are rising in power. The final barrier is lock-ins that exist within the food system. This diagram is something that we created in IPES-Food as part of a 2016 report about the needed change in paradigms from the industrialized food system to an agroecological food system. And some of these barriers include short-term thinking, compartmentalized thinking, the feed the world narrative, expectations of cheap food, the orientation toward exports instead of toward feeding our own people on a local or regional level, path dependency, and finally the measures of success that we're using. And all of this is held together and perpetuated by the growing concentration in the food system, which is escalating rapidly all the time. The number of industries that are controlling everything from inputs up through retail are getting smaller and smaller, so fewer and fewer people are involved in this. So it's about as far from food democracy as you can imagine. To overcome these barriers and to overcome the intransigence of the economic elite, we need a compelling vision. Remember, that was the beginning of a theory of change, a compelling vision about how life would improve for most people with a transformed food system under conditions of food sovereignty and food democracy. But where will we find vision? Those of us who are living in colonizer countries have often lost our sense of place and purpose and our connection with the natural world, which peasants and indigenous people have, but we can find inspiration in their writing and in their work. Two recent books that have come out by a Potawatomi indigenous botanist on the right and a black farmer provide some of this inspiration, and I recommend these books. They're both really wonderful. Some of the themes that recur in indigenous cosmologies are the idea of interdependence, and these things have been coming up over and over in this conference. Interdependence with and respect for nature, taking only what's necessary instead of exploiting and extracting from nature. Public stewardship of the commons instead of private ownership of resources. Avoiding waste versus squandering what we have. Eating as a spiritual act embedded in values versus looking at food as just another commodity that can be bought and sold, and the values that underlie it really don't matter. And you've probably figured out by now that the attributes on the left are the indigenous attributes that I'm trying to bring forward, and the ones on the right are the attributes that come with the industrialized food system. Next, inputs that are endogenous to the system versus external inputs, things that farmers have to buy that make them dependent on those concentrating food industries. And then finally, the ideas of sharing, care, and solidarity instead of individualism and everybody out for themselves. We should never forget, however, that the wisdom of indigenous and marginalized people has been forged through terrible suffering. The Indian author Arundhati Roy writes, "The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those with a different imagination, an imagination that is outside of capitalism as well as outside communism, an imagination that has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment." So this ties back in not only with the common attributes of indigenous peoples, but also with the fact that we're using the wrong metrics as we look at what success means in our society. The most recent report from Global Witness, which monitors violence against land defenders, says that 227 land and environmental defenders were murdered in 2020 for trying to protect their homes, lands, and livelihoods, and the ecosystems that are vital for biodiversity and for the climate. So they are literally being killed for their beliefs. Nelson Mandela reminds us that vision is only a part of the theory of change. We also need pragmatic action, which some of our panelists will be speaking to. Fortunately, we can find many examples of actions toward a better food system around us, people who are taking risks, sometimes taking beginning steps, but creating changes that benefit their communities and the natural world. I'll give you a few examples. First, some communities are beginning to put healthy food back into the commons rather than privatizing it and making it available only to people with money. And we're talking particularly about healthy food. So it should not be accessible only to moneyed people. Second, agroecology, another great example of pragmatic action. This diagram on the bottom you'll probably recognize from FAO, but these are some of the advantages up above of the things that agroecology brings. These are things that are advantageous to all of us, encouraging diversity, enhancing resilience to climate change, improving soil health for long-term productivity, decreasing the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticide use, which means that farmers aren't becoming so indebted, building greater self-sufficiency, increasing farmer autonomy, focusing on marginalized people and small-scale farmers. All good things. And My final example here, well, not my final example, I have one more. Food sovereignty is another great example with people all around the planet working on this. Food sovereignty, as you probably know, means control by people of their food systems. It's a growing demand from people who are coping with imposed regulations and with debt and impoverishment created by this global elite. Food sovereignty requires genuine food democracy to shift that control. Entire communities, here's my final example, are trying to shift toward well-being economies that place social welfare and environmental regeneration above profits by the few. And this diagram is Scotland's framework of action for a well-being economy. So let me conclude with one of Heal Alliance's strategic assumptions about what is needed for success. We need to build coalitions. The food movement alone is not big enough to create the transformation that we want. Our coalitions must be broad and inclusive, including groups working for climate justice, racial equity, human rights of people who have been put aside or marginalized, and the preservation of biodiversity. I think during this conference, you've already found and will continue to find many opportunities to make connections to help solidify the coalitions that you're trying to build. So thank you very much.